Japan and Russia's standoff over a chain of islands in the Pacific traces back to the end of the Second World War. That dispute, one reason why there is still no peace treaty between the two. Joining us live from Tokyo, James Brown, a professor of political science at Temple University, Japan. Professor Brown, this visit by Vladimir Putin, is that Russia's way of saying the door is now closed to any negotiations on that peace between the two?
Well, it's certainly an important development. I think from the Russian side, they would take the position that they'd actually already closed the door. When Russia, a few years ago, revised the constitution, they inserted a clause to make it essentially illegal to transfer any territory to another state. So from the Russian point of view, that issue was already essentially settled. Nonetheless, Putin's visit to these disputed islands is enormously important. Previously, he'd always maintained the image of being rather softer, more friendly towards Japan, in part by holding back from visiting these islands. President Medvedev, when he was the Russian head of state, did visit. That was in 2010, but Putin himself had always refrained from doing so.
All right. So it was a carefully managed appearance by the Kremlin to look as if one leader would be harder and one might be softer and more prepared. And Mr. Putin as well, just in Sakhalin, just before traveling to the Kuril Islands, specifically pointing to better ties under then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe.
Yes, so from the Russian point of view, what they would particularly like is a return to that era of better relations. Now, this existed from 2012 until 2020, when Abe was prime minister. And what the Russians did is they very much played up this idea that given Putin's friendly attitude towards Japan, given his respect for Japanese culture, including judo, that perhaps a deal could be done. And this really encouraged Abe to engage. He engaged by meeting Putin on multiple occasions, by inviting him to his hometown in Japan, by engaging in economic cooperation. So for the Russian side, this was wonderful. They didn't have to make any real concessions. They just had to generate a little bit of false hope, and Abe was encouraged to engage. Now, that largely came to an end after Abe left office and then following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So the Russian side had seemingly wanted to go back to that Abe era, and yet at the same time, by Putin visiting these islands, it looks increasingly unlikely that that will occur.
Another reason why this may be unlikely would be the reasons that made Mr. Abe more prepared to think of re-engaging Russia. Then those reasons are even less persuasive now.
Yes, that's right. It was a very different era. With a bit of optimism between 2012 and 2020, you could still see Russia as a potential partner. Now, that's much more difficult. It's not only the invasion of Ukraine, it's also the transformation of Russia's relationship with both China and North Korea. Now, if you look at Japanese official documentation, it makes very clear that they regard both China and also North Korea as major challenges to Japan's security. And with Russia cooperating so closely with both, that's seen as, in particular, magnifying the threat that North Korea poses to Japan. So for all of those reasons, a return to the Abe era is unlikely.
Earlier, we were speaking to our correspondent. She mentioned for Russia what was non-negotiable. So, for example, on the Kuril Islands. But for Japan, what happened in Ukraine, that would count as a non-negotiable position.
Yes, that's right. So I think the Russian side was somewhat surprised by the forcefulness of Japan's response after 2022. Sure, they knew that there was going to be sanctions from European Union countries, etc. But I think that Moscow perhaps expected Japan to largely sit on the sidelines. So when Japan introduced really quite tough sanctions and also strong support for Ukraine, I think there was some surprise from Moscow. What they failed to anticipate is the extent to which Japan would see the security of Ukraine as relevant to its own security. And that's because, in a phrase that has been used multiple times by Japanese politicians, there's the view that Ukraine today could be East Asia tomorrow, very much making the point that this is a matter of principle. If powerful states can ignore international law and use force to change the international status quo, well, if that could happen in Ukraine, it could also happen in East Asia. And in particular, Japan has in mind its territorial disputes, the status of the Senkaku Islands, and then also concerns about Taiwan.
Oh, that notion of threat, or the perception of threat, certainly hammered home, as you mentioned earlier, by the transformation of Japanese ties with both North Korea and China separately and in conjunction.
Yes, that's right. So from the point of view of Japanese security, security experts look at the region and they see a situation of unprecedented insecurity. For much of the Cold War, sure, they needed to have some concern about the Soviet Union, but the chances of the Soviet Union invading Hokkaido, Japan's northern island, were very remote. They could also rely on the enormous power of the US military. You look at the situation now, and it's very different. You have an aggressive Russia, you have an increasingly emboldened North Korea, you have China with much greater wealth and military power than before. You also have the United States that is seen as more unreliable and also perhaps in relative decline. And in this situation, it is simply a security nightmare for those three hostile powers, Russia, China, and North Korea, to be making common cause. And I think, above all, the real concern is the indications that Russia is supplying military technology to North Korea that could enhance the missile and nuclear threat that that regime poses to Japan.
Despite all that, final question, Professor Brown, there were signs, one would not call it a détente, but at least some reason to hope for slightly better ties in May between Japan and Russia. But that chance, you think, might be missed now. Final question.
Yeah, that's right. So what we had over the last few months is just some very tentative signs from Prime Minister Takaichi that she was exploring some level of re-engagement. You had an economic delegation from Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry going to Moscow in May. You also had a very brief encounter between the Foreign Minister Motegi and Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov on the sidelines of a summit in July, a few other things too. So it seemed like Takaichi was testing the water. And for those who were in favor of closer Japan-Russia ties, even at this time, they looked upon that with enthusiasm. They looked at it as potentially Takaichi going back to the Abe policy. After all, Takaichi sees the late Prime Minister Abe as her mentor. But now that seems increasingly unlikely. And indeed, in some of the comments that Prime Minister Takaichi has made in response to this visit by Putin, it indicates that she's going to instead take a more robust stance.
Oh, thanks. Professor James Brown from Temple University, Japan, looking at the repercussions, the implications of this first-time visit by Vladimir Putin to the Kuril Islands. Thanks for that.